Well, big highball hello to all the model railroaders and rail fans out there, and welcome to April 2022's edition of the Central Division. Hey, I'm up here in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and as you know, this is the city that my layout is based on. Behind us here is the headquarters of the Fort Smith Railroad. Now, this used to be Missouri Pacific Track, and a lot of the same industries and things that were switched by the Missouri Pacific Railroad are now switched by the Fort Smith Railroad. So what I want to be doing is taking you around the city. We're going to be looking at some of the industries and areas that the Missouri Pacific used to run back during the 1970s. Of course, a lot has changed, as well as we're going to be doing a little bit of switching and running on my layout. So stay with us and we're going to get started.
Now, one piece of documentation that has been a tremendous help when selecting the industries to put on my Fort Smith layout, and also this past weekend when I was tracing back the track of the Missouri Pacific in the Fort Smith area, a few years ago I came across a Missouri Pacific Industrial Track Numbers and Spotting Codes guide. So what this is documentation that was carried by the train crews that served in Fort Smith and Van Buren, and it helps them find the industry on the system map as well as a guide where to place the cars. So this also has a map with corresponding numbers for each industry. And so while the map is not to scale, what I was able to do is use it to kind of find a general area of where that industry is or was located at one time, and then use modern GPS and Google Earth and applications on my phone to narrow it down to the specific location. The Union Pacific acquired the Missouri Pacific back in 1982, and up in the Fort Smith areas after a short time, they actually turned over the local switching duties to a short line they helped establish called the Fort Smith Railroad. What's cool about these short lines is a lot of them use used equipment, so you can kind of spot some railroad history. Like here you see the old GP10 in the original Santa Fe colors. So I'm roughly maybe a mile down from the Fort Smith Railroad headquarters. And this field here used to be a pretty large warehouse. It's called the Riverside Terminal Warehouse. The Arkansas River is off to our left here, less than a quarter of a mile. And as I pan the camera over to the right, you're going to see a pavilion, and that was actually the site of a large furniture manufacturer, Garrett Furniture. It's just amazing in just 50 years how much change there is. I mean, looking at this area now, you'd never know those two industries were there. So the remains of the structure on the right, I couldn't find any information on that, and I'm assuming just based on the side of the track it's on that might have belonged to the warehouse facility, but just not 100% sure of that. As the camera is panning around, you see some hopper cars there in the background. There's some additional track there, and as we pan around, you'll see a yard in the distance. And these lines used to belong to the Frisco Railroad. Of course, the Frisco was acquired by the Burlington Northern in 1980, and today this track belongs to the Arkansas and Missouri Railroad. So I'm roughly about 2 miles northeast of where I've started at the Fort Smith Railroad headquarters, and here there's actually two tracks. One was a team track belonging to a company called Bates. I'm not sure what the Bates company did, and then there was also a spur for the Oklahoma Water and Power Company, and I'm assuming that it was some type of storage or warehouse. Of course, Oklahoma is just a stone's throw away from Fort Smith. So what is now used as a local team track used to actually be a spur that extended quite a ways, and it would have gone past the house you see there now and where the woods are, and actually served the Dixie Cup Company that was once in Fort Smith. Now, many of the industries once served by the Missouri Pacific in Fort Smith are still there and are currently being served by the Fort Smith Railroad. We're about 6 miles from the Fort Smith Railroad headquarters, and we're looking south here, and this is the runaround track and the spur for the Gerber Baby Food Company. Now, as I swing the camera toward the north, you get an idea of just how big the Gerber Baby Food Company is and why it needed not only a spur but a runaround track. Now, about a mile north from here is the Arkansas River crossing, and this is where the Missouri Pacific would have come over from Van Buren, Arkansas, into Fort Smith, Arkansas. So this would have been one of the first industries switched out as the Missouri Pacific came into Fort Smith. So I'm roughly, about 0.2 miles southwest of the Gerber Baby Food Company plant. And this is another plant that was served by the Missouri Pacific and is currently served by the Fort Smith Railroad today. It's called OK Foods today, and I'm assuming it's just an abbreviation for Oklahoma, so Oklahoma Foods. and it's one of the larger chicken processing plants in the Northwest Arkansas area. Now, back in the 70s, when it was being served by the Missouri Pacific, the company was called Spalding HG, and I'm assuming that it had, something to do with the food industry versus the sporting good industry. So just outside the plant on the spur, I caught some railroad cars sitting there, and one of them gives you an idea of what a food processing plant takes in from the railroad. If you see the tank car there, it's marked as edible beef tallow, and basically what that is, it's a beef fat that's added into a lot of processed foods. Now, in this group of cars outside of the OK Foods plant, I noticed one boxcar. It's now currently marked for the Fort Smith Railroad, but when I looked a little bit closer, it was kind of a ghost from the past. And if you look closely here, you'll see the old Mopac Eagle symbols. This actually belonged to the Missouri Pacific at one time. So the next stop on my Missouri Pacific switching tour is the old Arkansas Coffin Company. We're about 6 miles south of the Fort Smith Railroad headquarters. The Arkansas Coffin Company got its start about 1906, and about the mid-20th century, the name was changed to the Arkansas Casket Company, because casket was a more acceptable term by that time than coffin, but they never did change the lettering on the building. The company actually survived until the late 1980s and is a storage warehouse for a furniture company today. I've always been drawn to these, old turn of the 20th century brick buildings like the Arkansas Coffin Company. And so I thought, why not have an HO scale version of the Arkansas Coffin Company as one of the industries on my layout? So what you see here is an ITLA kit in the very, very early stages of construction. And this is not an exact replica of the Arkansas Coffin Company, but it's fairly close. And one day I hope to go back and actually scratch build an exact replica of the company, but for now I think this will be a pretty good substitution. So a few of the features I'm also going to include in my HO scale version is a replica of the water tower, and this is actually used for the sprinkler system, as well as some of the outlying buildings. And you see one of the buildings, or what remains of the building, the top of it there next to the railroad track. So before moving on, I wanted to show you another one of the old ghosts from Fort Smith's historical past. What you're seeing here is the remains of the old trolley line. Now, if you like trolleys, there's the Trolley Museum in downtown Fort Smith, and part of the line is still there. So one of the things you can do is actually ride the old trolley. So I'm now just across the street from the old Arkansas Coffin Company, and right here was another Missouri Pacific customer that is long gone. And where the tank cars are sitting now, that used to be the site of the Western Wheelbarrow Manufacturing Company. So for the last stop on my tour, I'm back in the downtown Fort Smith area, not far from where I started. I'm about a half mile from the Fort Smith Railroad Company. And as I'm panning the camera to the left here, believe it or not, at one time this was called the Bakery District. And up until the 1980s, there were 4 industrial bakeries here, all of them served by the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company. Now, the oldest and probably most well-known of these bakeries that once stood in this district was the Fort Smith Biscuit Company. You see here an old postcard showing an image of the original building. Now, the company grew fairly quickly and actually opened a second production facility across the street, and the 2 buildings were connected by a skywalk. And it's one of the industries I decided to model on my layout. So unfortunately, in 1987, without any more room to expand, the company decided to move to a new facility in Oklahoma. So the site of the original building of the Fort Smith Biscuit Company is now a U.S. Attorney's Office. But the cool thing is, because the company was so well known in Fort Smith, they did put a historical marker there, so it's not totally forgotten for anyone walking by. The year is 1975, and at this early fall morning, the crew of our GP7 in the Fort Smith, Arkansas yard is getting the locomotive started and is shuffling through the paperwork and getting prepared for today's switching duties. The yard's pretty full today, so the locomotive pulls out of the yard and then does a reverse move on the main to get around the yard and start the day's switching duties. Entering the yard from the opposite side, our GP7 now gently pushes the caboose to join her train. With the caboose now tied to her train, the GP7 is back on the main and is heading to the other side of the yard, but it'll stop at the Fort Smith Biscuit Company to pick up this empty. With a rail boxcar in tow, our GP7 heads back to the yard. Now back in the yard, the first duty of our GP7 is to drop off this rail boxcar. This boxcar is actually slated to be picked up by the Frisco Railroad, who exchanges with the Missouri Pacific at this yard location. Now once the car is tied down, our crew will move the locomotive over to the outgoing train to start the day's switching duties. Now free of the rail boxcar, our GP7 backs up and hooks onto the train. The train has been checked, the air test is completed, and our crew has just gotten clearance to leave the Fort Smith yard to start the day's switching duties. Hey, hope everyone's enjoyed this program, and I thought we'd go out with some shots of these great old locomotives used by the Fort Smith Railroad. Hey, I just want to give the subscribers out there a shout out. Again, as I always say, you're the ones that keep me motivated and going, and I do appreciate all that support. And if you haven't subscribed yet and like what you see, I invite you to do that. As always, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave those below. I always try to get back with those. And until next month, highball!